That's how pluralist democracy is supposed to work. It's a story that kids like me who grew up in the 60s and 70s were taught in school, what politicians and journalists wax nostalgically about when they talk about the good old days when both society and political parties were more genteel and less vicious, and America came together to promote the common good. Of course, in America, at least, the reality never fully matched the ideal. It is true that in the decades right after World War II, our democracy seemed to run relatively smoothly, with frequent cooperation across party lines and what felt like a broad consensus about how interests were shared and differences should be settled. And part of this was the result of America's unique dominance economically in the aftermath of the Great War. So you have industrial competitors all across Europe and Asia who are still digging themselves out of the rubble at the time, which meant that fat corporate profits and rising living standards here in the United States helped smooth over friction between competing groups, between management and labor, or the industrial and agricultural sectors. And meanwhile, the Cold War generated solidarity against an external threat, and a shared perspective on the world was constantly reinforced by a handful of TV networks, movie studios, newspaper chains, and magazines that served as nearly everybody's main source of news and entertainment. Everybody watched Gilligan's Island, even if they didn't admit it. See, I know what generation you're from. But the biggest reason that American pluralism seemed to be working so well mainly had to do with who it left out. The fact is, for most of our history, our democracy was built on top of a deeply entrenched caste system, formal and informal, based on race and gender and class and sexual orientation. A system that excluded or severely limited big chunks of the population from the corridors of power. Just to give you some perspective, as late as 2005, when I was sworn in as Illinois' junior senator, I was the only African American in the United States Senate. One out of 100. Only the third since Reconstruction. Out of 100 senators, there were exactly 2 Latinos. And only 14 women. It's fair to say that when everyone in Washington looked the same and shared the same experiences and were in the men's side of the Senate gym, because the women just had kind of a closet that they had modified, cutting deals and getting along was a whole lot simpler. And then starting with the civil rights movement in the early 60s, things got more complicated. So in rapid succession, historically marginalized groups, blacks, Latinos, Asians, Native Americans, women, gays and lesbians, disabled Americans, demanded a seat at the table. Not only did they insist on a fair share of government-directed resources, but they brought with them new issues born of their unique experiences that could not just be resolved by giving them a bigger slice of the pie. So racial minorities insisted that the government intervene more deeply into the private sector and civil society to root out long-standing systemic discrimination. Women, the gall of them, called for greater autonomy over their own bodies, while gays and lesbians stepped out of the shadows to demand equal treatment under the law, posing direct challenges to widely held religious and social norms. In other words, politics was not just a fight about tax rates or roads anymore. It was about more fundamental issues that went to the core of our being and how we expected society to structure itself. Issues of identity and status and gender. Issues of family, values, faith. Historically disadvantaged groups began to question the legitimacy of the system as a whole when they had played no part in writing its rules. Public arguments became louder and more contentious and more emotional. And in the face of all these challenges to the status quo, a lot of people, yes, those at the top of the pecking order, but also those who had just been raised to put their faith in authority and tradition, began to feel that their way of life, the American way of life, was under attack. This would have been a lot for any democracy to manage, even in good times. But of course, all this was happening against the backdrop of a rapidly changing economy. Changes that would massively increase inequality and widen the divide between rural and urban communities and advantage so-called knowledge workers over those without college degrees. And for a lot of Americans, such changes translated into stagnant wages and rising costs, and it increased their sense that others were benefiting at their expense. And that's not all. The new economy also upended residential and living patterns. So it reduced the likelihood that people from different backgrounds interacted at neighborhood stores or Little League games. People who are wealthier send suddenly their kids to private schools. So not only are their kids not interacting with regular folks, but they aren't either. It contributed to the weakening of, again, political science term, what folks call mediating institutions, unions, churches, civic organizations. These institutions that had once been the building blocks of democratic participation and a vital bridge between otherwise disparate groups. And more people found themselves isolated without natural communities. And with the Cold War over, with generations scarred by Vietnam and Iraq, and a media landscape that would shatter into a million disparate voices, appeals to a common national story or a common national purpose increasingly fell on deaf ears. And we know what happened next, because we are still living it. It's been called the great political sorting that started with the mass exodus of Southern white voters from Democratic to Republican parties is now almost complete, with each party more and more uniform in its beliefs, less tolerant of dissenting views. Media companies have figured out that there's a profit in playing to the extremes. Since that's what gets attention, politicians and party leaders and interest groups are incentivized to take a maximalist position on almost every issue. Every election becomes an act of mortal combat in which political opponents are enemies to be vanquished, and compromise is viewed as betrayal and total